Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for inviting me to come back and talk to you. As Laura told us, I did work on a project several years ago. A group of scholars got together to study Cassadaga, its history, its architecture, some of the biographies of some of the mediums who had been there a long time, and then I wrote an article about how the group had changed over time. So I wanted to share some of that, share some of the highlights of that article with you today. And it's somehow appropriate. Today is All Saints' Day, tomorrow's All Souls' Day. And as you know, spiritualism has a lot to do with this communication with the spirits of those who have passed on. And in fact, that's usually what people think about when they think about spiritualism. But the people who actually founded the spiritualist movement were actually interested in something else as well. They were interested in scientifically proving the truths of Christianity, particularly this idea of the immortality of the soul. And this was the age of the rise of science. And so they thought that through all of these different rituals that they had and various kinds of seances and table tipping and demonstrations, that they could actually prove the immortality of the soul, which up until then had been a matter of faith. Okay, so spiritualism becomes popular in the United States in the 1840s and 1850s. That's when it sort of gets off the ground. It becomes a very popular religious movement very quickly, within about a decade. There are churches that are set up, associations of churches that are set up. At one point, Cleveland, Ohio has more spiritualist churches than any other type of church, about 1850. Sometimes they also organize summer camps, and that's how we get to Cassadaga. Generally, these summer camps were set up by wealthy spiritualists. They were places for lectures, for seances, various kinds of spirit demonstrations. They oftentimes had cottages where people could come and stay for a summer or for a few weeks. They would have a cafeteria, an auditorium. They'd have a dance hall. It's one of the only places, as you'll see in Central Florida, where you can get a drink and dance. And one of these camps was called the Cassadaga Free Lake Association. It was in upstate New York, western New York, and it was established in 1879. 15 of these camps are were still in operation by 1979. So there's something that sort of persisted over the years with spiritualism. Even though spiritualism sort of reached its apex, I would say probably in the 1920s, 1930s, and then since then it's been on a steady decline. The camps that were set up during this period, many of them are still around. So let's talk about Cassadaga. It was actually named after the Cassadaga Free Lake Association, and that camp became known as Lilydale. Some of you probably heard of that. It's in upstate New York. And the story of Cassadaga is that there was a gentleman, a medium actually, by the name of George Colby, and he would give seances and do readings and so on in Iowa and Wisconsin. And he had a spirit guide named Seneca. Many of these spiritualist mediums would have various spirit guides, and oftentimes they were Native American spirits. This is an interesting aspect of spiritualism. He received guidance that he should go to Florida. And if you're living in Wisconsin in the winter, that's probably not a bad message to get. Although air conditioning had not yet been invented. So he goes to Florida. He arrives in Jacksonville by train, and then he takes a boat, like many of the early settlers, down the St. Johns River, gets out at Orange City, and his spirit guide shows him to this sort of little ridge area with a lot of pines, which today is Cassadaga. He establishes a homestead. He starts a dairy farm, and he also creates a kind of shelter for orphans. Right? So he takes care of a lot of orphan kids there. Well, spiritualists from the north were looking for a way to extend the fun from the summers into the winter. And of course, as you know, many wealthy northerners were coming down to Florida and establishing places, hotels and residences for them to stay over the winter. So some of them actually came down and with the idea of starting a winter camp for the spiritualists of Lilydale down in Florida. They looked at two sites. They looked at De Leon Springs, and then they looked at George Colby's property. And I'm not exactly sure what made the difference, but they decided to choose George Colby's property. Otherwise, when you went out to the old sugar mill for a pancake breakfast, there would be a spiritualist church, but that didn't happen, or spiritualist camp. So the Cassadaga Spiritualist Camp gets established in 1894. It's a nonprofit corporation. It has a threefold mission. The first part of that mission was to promote the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. It's one of the really important doctrines to them. The second was to promote the doctrine of the nearness of the spirit world. The spirit world is not something way off from Alpha Centauri, that it's actually right here around us all the time. And the third doctrine was the possibility of communication between this world and the next. Now, if you know anything about tribal religions, these are all sort of understood realities, right? That there's a permeability between this world and the world of the spirits, and that certain people, shamans usually, are able to go into a special trance state and have communication with these various spirit beings. In a sense, you can say that spiritualist mediums are sort of like modern day shamans, in the sense that they can go into this special state and have communication, they say, with spirits of the Okay, so Colby ends up deeding 35 acres of his property to the Spiritualist Camp Association in 1895, and the first camp meeting draws 100 people to visit the mediums who are in residence there over that particular winter. By 1898, the camp has 8 cottages. It has a lodging hall, a library, dancing pavilion. And the camp, interestingly enough, coexists peacefully with their Protestant Christian neighbors. Now that's something you would normally think. You know, most Protestant Christians, evangelicals, have a very dubious attitude toward any kind of spirit communication. But somehow they coexisted peacefully, and I think this has to do with several factors. First of all, the people who came to the Spiritualist camp at Cassadaga shared American middle-class values. They believed in capitalism, they believed in patriotism, they believed in sobriety, most of them. There was some bad press from time to time, but I'm told by the old-timers in the land area that if you wanted to go to a good party and a good dance, Cassadaga was the place to go. Because it was a dry area, a lot of Baptists. So they begin pulling in thousands of visitors every year. It was also good for local businesses, right? When all these people came down in the winter to attend the various lectures and dances and other kinds of events at the Cassadaga Hotel and in the Cassadaga area. They had to stay in area hotels, they had to buy gas and so forth. So it was good for local businesses as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was allowed to coexist so peacefully. One of the first buildings that was built was the Colby Memorial Temple. This is a picture of that. This was built in the 1920s. And then they also built the Cassadaga Hotel. Now this is the basic structure of the Cassadaga Hotel, but it's been renovated many times. And there wasn't a big fire there in the 1920s. Another picture of the Cassadaga Hotel. The hotel, by the way, is outside the border of the Spiritualist camp itself. The Spiritualist camp itself has a very circumscribed border. We'll talk a little bit about some of the businesses that have grown up on the periphery of the camp itself. So the 1930s were a boom time in Cassadaga, a lot of people visiting. The winters attracted mediums from all over the world, and by this time there were 30 to 40 full-time resident mediums at Cassadaga. Visitors stayed at hotels in Cassadaga, in Orange City, at DeLand. There were seances, there was table tipping, there were dances, lectures, and a number of church services. The camp underwent a steady decline into the 1960s and 1970s. It became sort of almost an anachronism in Central Florida. but it still was a kind of place where people who did not want, who were outside the mainstream of Christian churches, felt that they could go and pursue their spiritual journey without judgment, with people who understood who they were. Sometime during the 1970s and 1980s, the New Age movement started to infiltrate Cassadaga. But it makes sense that it would. It was open, people there are very open to alternative forms of spirituality. And in time, it became no longer a purveyor of straight-up spiritualism, historical spiritualism, right, with seances and table tipping and trumpets and so forth. Most mediums began to work privately, and many started becoming spiritual counselors. It sort of took on this sort of more of a healing mission, or a therapeutic mission, in addition to just talking to the spirits. A number of businesses, and let me give you a couple of instances of this. If you go through Cassadaga, this is one of the streets, Old Spiritualist Street and Mediumship Way. And you can see here at the bookstore, Certified Spiritual Healers is up above Certified Mediums. Although you have camp mediums available. I always like this little sign, caution, spirit crossing ahead, one of the streets there. And this is an example of a person who formerly was a medium, but now bills herself as a spiritual counselor, and this particular person also does spirit guide drawings, Reverend Elizabeth Owens. She may have spoken here. Has she ever spoken here, Janie Owens? Yeah, she's a fairly well-known person in the area. Here you start to see what some of the businesses on the periphery of the camp look like. So this is Sydney, psychic medium, handwriting expert. Here you have the Universal Center of Cassadaga. It has nothing to do with the camp. Readings available, spiritual, mental, physical. One of Florida's largest selection of metaphysical books, CDs, and gifts. Again, on the periphery of the camp. And here's another example of that. The Cassadaga Spiritualist Psychic Therapy Center. Again, has nothing to do with the camp itself. And aura photography, half done. Well, a number of people built homes in the area. Most of the people who live at Cassadaga are mediums or mediums in training, because they do have a training program down there. This was the home of Eloise Page, who was one of the most famous mediums there. And this little pond here is part of the community. It's called Spirit Pond. The last few years it's been dry, but rains have come back, so now it's back in full flower. This is the actual Eloise Page Memorial Garden set up for her, and then you see one of the typical residences in the camp behind it. Now, as I mentioned, many people began working as not only spirit mediums, but also as spiritual counselors and spiritual healers. And a number of healing practices take place at the community, and I would really say it's become a kind of therapeutic community now. That's its main mission, I would say. It's not straight up spiritualism, it's more providing therapeutic services for people. One example of this is the Caesar Foreman Healing Center. It's a kind of gazebo out in front of the main Colby Memorial Temple. And before services, for about half an hour, you could go in and have a spiritual healer do various kinds of passes with you. I imagine many of you have been down there. So that's one of the things that happens. They have a Wednesday night candlelight service during their Sunday services. So right now, actually at this time, people would be sitting on a bench or on stools, and the mediums would be coming up and doing various auric passes and healing on them. So that's even incorporated into their Sunday service. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the New Age movement and why it was so conducive to Cassadaga. The New Age movement has 5 main characteristics. The first is that there's this belief that humanity is on the verge of this radical spiritual awakening. Right, some of you remember the harmonic convergence of 1987, when People thought that humanity was on the verge of this great spiritual shift. So that's very much a part of the New Age movement, this expectation of a coming great awakening. The second characteristic is that in the New Age movement is that people have the right to design their own spirituality, designer spirituality, using elements that they draw from many different traditions. So in that sense, it's similar to Unitarian Universalism in that there's a respect for, a recognition that truth can be found in many traditions. In the New Age movement, there's this idea that you can sort of mine those different traditions and create a kind of spirituality that works for you. There's also a belief in the spiritual, or in the New Age community, that communication with higher spiritual beings is possible. They call it channeling, right? Or a person sort of channels a higher spiritual teacher who then speaks to them. Ramtha, there's all these different examples of that in the New Age movement. Of course, that makes it very kind of a parallel tradition to spiritualism as well. There's also in the New Age movement a desire to reconcile science and religion in ways that enhance the human condition, both physically and spiritually. So there's no sense of enmity in the New Age movement between science and religion, and I think that's also very true for spiritualism. Spiritualism really wanted to use the methods and the authority of science to prove spiritual truths. And then finally, in the New Age movement, there was this ethic of self-healing, of self-empowerment, and particularly this embrace of many alternative healing therapies. And I think this is all very compatible with modern-day Cassadaga, especially this focus on healing. Cassadaga has really become a community whose main service is therapeutic. So there's counseling, there's spiritual healing, providing consolation to those who have lost loved ones. There are many different kinds of healing classes that you can take there, polarity massage, Reiki, all these different kinds of alternative healing practices. And the camp, as I mentioned, does certify spiritualist healers. And they actually have a kind of a certification program. Okay, let's see if I've got it. Yeah, so there's also a strong kind of teaching mission at Cassadaga. They have a number of classes to talk about spiritualism, to talk about every aspect of the spiritual path. It's extremely eclectic. You find people coming there from lots of different traditions talking about their particular take on spiritual unfoldment, particularly on these alternative healing therapies. This is the Cassadaga bookstore. You can find, if you go in there, you can find a vast panoply of spiritual teachings and various artifacts from various spiritual traditions. I'm sure you could find a Tibetan bell there, as well as many, many other kinds of things. This is a close-up. It's called the Andrew Jackson Davis Educational Building and Bookstore. Andrew Jackson Davis, by the way, was a very famous medium from the early days of spiritualism who actually created a whole cosmology in his writings. So he's quite well respected there. This is another aspect of sort of this combination of traditions. They actually have a park there called the Medicine Wheel Park, honoring the Native American spirit. And they do drum circles, they do various kinds of fires at night. But you can see this sort of drawing on some of the Native American healing traditions and rituals for that. And that's that. Okay, so I think the main shift that's taken place is a kind of generational shift to Cassadaga. The older generation still is very much focused on traditional spiritualism, so public seances, material mediumship, they call physical manifestations or demonstrations. The photography that you're talking about is part of that. And a very Christian-influenced worship style or church style. But there's kind of a struggle now between these older residents at the camp and a younger generation who wants to bring in a lot of these New Age practices, and it's much more eclectic in the way that it practices spiritualism. So these newer, younger residents want to welcome all who are seeking alternative forms of spirituality. It's much more welcoming in a sense. And I think that it's vital to the camp's long-term viability in the contemporary religious marketplace that they do have this broader opening and the kind of worship style and spiritual practices that they teach that come from a much broader palette than traditional spiritualism has been able to do. And I think it's true with all religious movements. You have to adapt to survive. And Cassadaga, I think, is one of the reasons that it's been able to survive is that it's been able to adapt in this changing spiritual marketplace of late 20th century and early 21st century spirituality. So thanks very much.
Thank you.